Hello, remote logged-in guest. Lansing am I. Lansing remembers. What files would you like to access today? Examination in History of Post-War Quebec Monarchy. Accessing. It would be easy to stereotype the Quebecois as the bogeymen of the Lansing Republic. There was a real danger that the four white lilies would be hoisted over the Lansing Congress during the Four-Father War. The Sauk in particular detest the Quebecois since they routinely suffer border clashes with the Vulpiniers and Chasseurs that engage in missions across the trench works. Singers tend to think the Quebecois as being political animals bent on the spread of their fascist monarchy by any means available, particularly assassination. The Kicks are too concerned with the forefathers to have an opinion on the matter, and the Connies characterize the Quebecois as being poutine-eating jazz aficionados of little regard. Yoopers tend to think of them as inferior marksmen and great targets, but none of these characterizations are accurate. Well, Lansing admits that perhaps the Quebecois dedication to jazz is factual, but the rest is very subjective and painted on the Quebecois so that Ganders do not have to have any conflicted emotions about the fate of the Canadian province and the horrors its current government inflicts upon its subjects. After the Great War of 2077, there were 3 years of great confusion. From 2077 until 2080, there was great strife and calamity. Though much of the former Canadian Union was spared direct hits from nuclear strikes, the loss of trade and food supplies greatly reduced the Canadian population. As is common in any time of trouble, people turned to the assurance of religion to bring them hope to endure their difficulties. Much of the population of Quebec was of the Catholic faith. The Catholic cardinals that had survived the war met as a council and composed a provisional set of rules for what they would call the North American Catholic Dements. This dements would cede its authority as soon as contact with whatever remained of the Vatican and the Holy See could be initiated. They elected from amongst themselves a prime cardinal, or a primate, but it was not long until people, particularly the laity, of the Church were simply referring to this post as the Pope. By 2079, various small bands of mercenaries and militias had banded together to defend Quebec from various raids by their neighbors and the occasional mutant monster that emerged from the ruins of New York City. These informal units, survivors of the Canadian military, American military, and various disaster prepper movements, encountered a problem of maintaining a sense of unit integrity. That is to say, the various troopers were unsure as to what ends and for whom they were fighting for. The mixture of troops from foreign powers and those of a paramilitary background made for units that not only experienced an equal amount of professionalism, but an equal amounts of loyalty to one another under fire. Native Quebecois units, having inherited the fiercely guarded cultural identity of being Quebecois, were particularly difficult to force into operations in cooperation with others of a different ethnic origin. To provide the newly forming units with an esprit de corps, the leaders of the growing force chose a new role model for them to emulate, that of the Grande Armée of Napoleonic France. But the disunity that the former Canadian provinces were beset with would disrupt any attempts to unify the provinces or the military for some time. While the army was being recast in Napoleonic spirit, the rest of the Quebec and Canadian society was also experiencing a massive shift of its culture. The use of the English language began to decline as Quebec City and the Quebecois rose in military power and prominence. Protestant faiths were pushed into the shadows as the post-war Catholic hybridization swept the countryside along with its French-speaking adherents. The Canadian Union had dissolved. Newfoundland and Labrador parted and became a frontier of disorganized villages and fortified city-states. Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island had been inexplicably hit hard by nuclear strikes, and what human culture remained there centered around raider bands and war bands dominating the local area. The nuclear ruins of New York spawned monsters that would occasionally raid into the former province of Quebec, forever preventing its southern expansion. Manitoba, British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan lost all communication with the heartland of the Canadian survivors, going dark. Everything north of Hudson Bay descended into barbarity as raids emerged from Greenland, where some weird power had taken up residence. The remaining provinces of Quebec and Ontario seemed to be all that had survived, as their anti-missile defense systems, bought from the American government before the war, had managed to destroy many of the nuclear warheads that had been fired at them. Ottawa, Montreal, and Quebec City formed now a crescent-shaped territory that had preserved pre-war humanity and the vestiges of that culture as best it could. But this would gradually decline. Quebec City became a manufacturing hub, and as time progressed, ended up providing the bulk of the armament and refined materials to the rest of the Canadian survivors. This in turn gave it enormous political power, as always accompanies market power and military power, Small settlements would submit to the Quebecois for protection and for trade, and forsook their former manner of living to adopt Quebecois customs and language. Ottawa began to attract scientists and medical pioneers. What remains of Ottawa's society to this day is still something of a medical mecca, particularly for the study of improving fast-acting medicinal agents, such as stem packs. Montreal attempted to preserve the culture of the pre-war era, but failing to do that, began to develop a new hybridization and cultural paradigm that could preserve the human spirit and foster unity amongst the emerging era. Though more populous than Quebec City, Montreal is something of a second-tier city compared to Quebec City. On March 2, 2079, Quebec proclaimed itself an independent monarchy under the rule of King Michel le Rond. Dubbed King Michel I, the primate of the newly formed New World Catholic Church would coronate him in Holy Trinity Cathedral at 31 Rue des Jardins. Many comment that this coronation was inspired by bayonets rather than any holy vision. The monarchy still parades its newly coronated and its heirs down the Rue des Jardins for the public to see and to adore. Later that year, in October, Ontario would declare itself an independent republic and would quickly send a peace party to King Michel to establish a peace accord. Having much to do himself and to arrange, the king agreed to the peace accord rather than to fight a war with forces of whose loyalty he could not be entirely sure. However, unhappy with the way the Provisional Parliament of Ontario had elected to perform its declaration, and of the Provisional Parliament of Ontario's position on armaments and regulations, the city of Ottawa rebelled and declared itself an independent city-state. They too quickly sent a diplomatic mission to King Michel, and it was also accepted. For a time, it appeared that there may be a peaceful coexistence between these three emerging powers. King Michel knew that the true test of peace would be whoever could organize their armed forces the best. However, he needed to establish some vision for how the army would be organized and operate. He quickly went to work organizing his forces into divisions that are still used today by the Quebecois army. These divisions are as follows. Soldat, militia. Soldats are the term that the monarchy uses to refer to soldiers that are quickly drafted into service. Often these soldiers are armed with what they can provide for themselves. Typically they are placed only in rear areas to guard supply trains or to garrison forts. Soldats, however, were used to some effect in the Forefather War to bolster attack pushes by the Fusiliers. Fusilier, light infantry. The Fusiliers are troops that have had professional training. They make up the bulk of the monarchy's reserves and compose the majority of the monarchy's fighting force. Armed with serviceable rifles made in the post-war era, a Fusilier is likely to have a single-round capacity breech-loading rifle, sometimes called a trapdoor rifle, or a rifle with a limited magazine capacity, typically no more than 5 to 10 rounds, and patterned on the old M1 American military rifle. Typically they have no armor and carry perhaps 1 or 2 hand grenades that they can toss. Many will also carry a reserve sidearm. A Fusilier's main training, however, is concerned around that of their athletic ability. The typical Fusilier can run faster and for longer duration than any of their Lansing counterparts. Carabiner, riflemen, heavy infantry. The Carabiners are experienced and talented marksmen that have usually been promoted from the ranks of the Fusiliers. Carabiners are given much better weaponry and armor by the monarchy. Fully automatic weapons and large caliber sniping rifles are the norm. Typically, a member of the Carabiners is a lifer and has already served between 4 to 5 years in the Fusiliers. Grenadiers. The monarchy uses this term, grenadier, to reflect those troops who have been trained to better handle explosives and heavy weapons. Energy weapons, such as laser rifles and plasma rifles, are also the reserve province of this corps. Grenadiers are drafted upward from the Fusiliers by sergeants who recognize their ability and self-control. As energy weapons are difficult to procure and the ammunition somewhat hard to manufacture, the last thing the monarchy can afford is for their troops to expend this ammunition willy-nilly and ineffectively. Cannoneers. The monarchy's trainers are always looking for soldiers with advanced mathematic acumen. These soldiers are diverted into either the ingénieurs militaires or become cannoneers. Cannoneers are responsible for operating the heavy ordnance and the big guns of the army. They are very highly paid, and compared to the rest of the army, also very highly prized. Cannoneers were instrumental in the advances of the army, and due to their success in using the tactic of the lead rain in all their former military campaigns, they have enjoyed a great amount of prestige. The lead rain tactic involves infantry advancing behind an artillery bombardment. Often this artillery bombardment creeps forward as the infantry advances, sometimes falling as short as a mere 300 feet from the advancing infantry line. Due to the hard lessons, however, of the Forefather War, cannoneers are beginning to fall out of favor and are gradually being altered in their service model to be defensive in their deployment rather than offensive. Cannons are now seen as a method to help hold territory rather than forcibly take it. Voltigeurs, foxtails, vulpiniers. Originally, the Special Forces Service of the Monarchy were called the Voltigeurs, to reflect the increased athleticism that was required to join this force. But as time advanced, the term vulpiniers, foxes, arose from the foxtail award that such servicemen were given after exceptionally crafty or secret missions were accomplished. Foxtails lead the advance of the army by finding sensitive targets to prepare for an assault, ferret out intelligence, and terrorize the countryside ahead of their advance. Foxtail units were also responsible for many atrocities in the Forefather War and have a history of being used by the Quebec Army as assassins. Docteurs militaires. The medical arm of the armed services is a separate corps and organization from the Army. Rather than integrate doctors into the other armed services, the medical corps has been kept separate. This was done so that doctors would not become overly familiar with the troops that they may have to treat, or in extreme cases, to euthanize when medical care is not possible. Doctors of the monarchy do not have to be sworn to a Hippocratic oath and instead swear loyalty to the state. This in turn makes for a flexible morality, allowing the doctors militaires to perform medical experiments that would turn the stomach of most Lansing Republic members. Officiers du Régiment. The intelligence and communication corps of the Army were combined so that radio operators would not be security risks as they would handle sensitive information, namely the movement of troops and logistics. This has actually worked out fairly well for the Army, as it's prevented generals from gaining access to the ability to coordinate massive movements of troops in a coup attempt. The only disadvantage has been the slowing of an advance, or the inability to respond spontaneously to an opportunity that might present itself on a battlefield, as was experienced during the Revenge March. Many of the Army's generals believe that result to have been a fluke, and so this corps has not changed in its operation or its secrecy. Chasseurs, hunters. The chasseurs are foragers and scouts for the fusiliers that advance behind them. Many foxtails end up being promoted from these ranks. Chasseurs are lightly armed but tend to be highly motivated and have high-quality weaponry and a great deal of accuracy with their weapons. Cuirassier, power armor operator. The monarchy has had great trouble maintaining its power armor corps. Between a lack of material and skilled technicians to maintain the suits, the cuirassiers are a plagued arm of the service. Many generals have begun to devalue them, and simply will only deploy them now alongside fusiliers who are having a hard time taking a position. Many generals would rather call in a warbot or have artillery barrage said position. Logistically, this is easy to understand, as it is more difficult to supply a power armor suit with the maintenance and the parts that it needs than it is a warbot. Warbots can be made to a factory standard. Power armor suits must be tailored to each individual pilot. But because of this last feature of the power armor technology, that of being tailored to the pilots, the cuirassiers are normally active members of the Army from the time they first enlist until their dotage, and this in turn means that the average cuirassier is the best prepared and motivated infantryman amongst the fusiliers he augments. He is the one they will rally behind when things get tough. He is the one that will help them keep the mission upon the task. He is the one that will be sure they take their position. Cuirassiers often lament that they are the unloved but indispensable children of the Army. They sometimes receive derogatory treatment from other corps that view them as being inferior or being phased out of existence. Insults such as garbage can or garbage man are not uncommon to overhear in mess halls. Hussar, robot operator. Originally, the Hussars were an arm that maintained and operated the few armored vehicles that the monarchy had scrapped together in the post-war era. The Hussars, however, did not fare very well during the Forefather War, when Lansing junk box showed just how vulnerable an old-style APC or tank was to someone in a junk box suit, or even someone in power armored infantry armor. In recent years, the Corps has shifted and begun the slow task of learning to operate warbots of their own. Production is soon nearing the level that the Lansing Republic has for its own junk bots. A Monarchy warbot is often inferior in armament to its Lansing counterpart, but their speed is comparable and their armor is often better. The Hussars are believed to be the home and the hope for the Monarchy's next push into Lansing territory, since reliance on the lead rain tactics has begun to prove ineffective. A new theory of warfare is being built around these warbots and is being called Botskrieg. Ingenieurs militaires. The last and most important arm of the military is that of their engineers. Responsible not only for the building and working of fortifications and defenses, the ingenieurs militaires is also the research and development branch of the monarchy's army. The best and the brightest scientists are diverted into this branch of the service. In recent years, they have not been able to replicate Project Juggernaut, but have begun constructing their own warbots and have come very close to replicating the drone technology used by the MMR to help patrol their skies, and this is considered the biggest threat to Lansing's security. However, all of the above divisions were not King Marcel's best weapons for his army. His most potent military force was that of his spies. By planting spies inside the Ontarian and Ottawan high society, he secretly manipulated them into deploying actions that benefited the monarchy. By using a combination of blackmail, propaganda, bribes, and discreet political violence, he was able to dictate the two other polities' actions and also keep them out of the way of the monarchy's advanced aims. The society that the monarchy adopted has developed along pseudo-feudal lines. There was no individual architect for this design. It more or less evolved independently due to resource shortages and the threats that came out of the nuclear wastes. This structure allowed the monarchy to guarantee a sustainable level of agriculture and also be able to dominate its society. By arresting its populace that it had survived into placing it into production with a cask's manacles, this gave the monarchy almost complete control over the mindset of that populace. They ended up having no reason to resist the monarchy's demands. They were eating enough, cared for, defended, and the problems of governments were being handled by others that seemed better qualified. The primary concern of all humans, based on their biology, that of living and making other humans and dying gracefully, was then all that was left for a farmer to ever care about. At the bottom of this new social structure were the serfs. Much like their medieval predecessors, a serf is bound to the land he works. The travel from their plots was easier than historically possible, so that trade and healthy gene stock would be fostered amongst the monarchy's citizens. It is not uncommon to see villages have marriages across serf lines. By that we mean, serfs from one village will travel to another and marry into the serfs of that village. Above the serfs were the tradesmen, who did not own land but were free to travel as they will. These gravitated towards trade and professions that would be highly paid, such as doctors, wandering mechanics, stonemasons, and architects. Landowners were the next highest tier. Landowners were divided into three substrata amongst their members. The lowest was the villein, being a landholder of a farmland, perhaps a single plot or a few more, and perhaps a few businesses that were located in the town center. Villeins were allowed to travel and to marry into any case that they wished. Thus it is not uncommon to see a villein marry a pretty serf girl. The children of such marriages are considered to be villeins if one of the parents is not. Above the villein were the brugers. These were non-noble landowners who owned a considerable area of land in the countryside or many businesses inside a town. Normally this class has had its hands in the production of major trading caravans and uses its money to great effort to influence society. Hated by those below them for having higher station, and hated by those above them for having lower station, the brugers are in the most tentative position of their society, the middle. The highest level of landowners was also the lowest tier of the nobility, and is often called the knights or the chevaliers. With titles awarded from battle, proven ability, or handed down by heredity, the knights are often doubled as the officers in the army. Relying on military prestige and political connection, the knights often use their station to dominate city councils and effectively create an additional branch of the government that would determine how local resources are to be divided and local laws are to be enforced. In the nobility, the ranks of marquis, marquess, duke, and duchess represent the governors of territories. Unlike the republics that lay to the west of the monarchy, territories in the monarchy are governed by hereditary titled officers. A new territory can only be added by conquest. As a result, many an ignored marquis and duchess is always looking for new land to conquer, and this directs interior aggression outward so that the monarchy can foster better government for its inefficient policies inside its own borders. Thus, if a territory is particularly inefficiently run, as long as the aggression and discontent can be placed outward on raiders or the territory that can be improved, the citizenry tends not to complain. And this has been a great benefit to the monarchy society, and since the stalled expansion of the Forefather War, the monarchy is trying to find some way around this feature of its society it has engendered, for it is now running out of land to conquer. At the highest tier of society are the royal families. These families compete amongst themselves to see who will be the king or queen when one family falls out of favor. The confidence in a particular leader is quietly expressed at court, and a constant hush-hush game of keeping and gaining confidence amongst the other royals is always in play. This may seem at first to be counterintuitive or unproductive, but rather than foster an incessant violent infighting, it has instead fostered a culture where each royal seeks to do great deeds and show good judgment to gain the confidence of the other royals. At the highest of the highest sits the monarch. The monarch is the ultimate power of life and death in the monarchy, and their word is law. But a monarch that does not listen to his royal court will not be a monarch for very long. By 2090, King Marcel was beginning the process of handing over his creation to his ambitious son, Philippe I, often called the Serpent King. In the time that had transpired, Marcel had built up a stable infrastructure and propaganda machine, as well as a military that outnumbered those that bordered him by a factor of 3. But as Marcel was about to launch the attack, missives from the Lansing Republic and former portions of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, as well as Ottawa and Ontario, reached him and pronounced an agreement that would form a league called the Greater Northern Republic. The GNR's articles allowed each province to self-govern its own affairs, so long as it freely traded and aided one another's defense and emergency relief efforts. Seeing an opportunity to further build up his military for a push, and to infiltrate the other provinces with spies, Michel agreed to join the GNR, much to the protestations of his son. Marcel died later that year, peacefully in his sleep. There is no official medical reason to believe it was a result of poisoning. No official reason to believe it was poisoning. Philippe, a cold-hearted and materialistic man, felt that his people had been held back by the reliance on superstition and religion as a guide. Lansing considers this to be the beginning of the slide to true tyranny and ethical decline of the monarchy. For if one relies upon money and glory to reward one's citizens, what will motivate them to be moral and ethical when the money is gone and the chances for glory are slim? But Lansing finds that Lansing is not often asked about human philosophical dilemmas, as Lansing is a machine. In 2084, an attempt to expand the monarchy's holdings around the northern part of the Ontarian border had been thwarted, and the troops that had returned claimed they had been repelled by elves that had defeated them. The official report, however, blames the Ontarian militia. Philip, upset by this supposed supernatural malaise, began a societal transformation by using the propaganda machine his father had made to turn popular opinion away from the church and towards that of the throne. First, he began promoting only those people with a similar worldview of his own into positions of power. Next, he dismissed anyone that was overtly religious from power and replaced them with someone more to his liking. The tone of the administration he wished for was perceived by that of his noble court, none too religious or moral themselves, and they followed suit. Within a decade, he had successfully changed the attitude of the Quebecois society. A hard turn towards worship and admiration of the monarch replaced that of the primate. In addition, Philippe infiltrated agents into the New World Catholic Church to corrupt its processes. Soon many of the church's upper echelons were in Philip's pocket, though to his credit, not the primate at this time. One of the cardinals of Quebec was so upset by the corruption that he saw, and worried about it that he began to speak up. This resulted in a failed attempt upon his life, and he left. That man was Abraham Maslow, who in 2093 would leave Quebec and migrate to the Lower Peninsula of Michigan to found the Nova Pax Church. As if Philip's machinations were not enough, fate handed him a wonderful opportunity in 2094. Massive outbreaks of measles crossed the North American continent. No one is sure what caused the outbreaks to this day, but such widespread contagion implies either a massive mutation in the disease, allowing it to become vastly potent and remain airborne for quite long periods of time, or, and more plausibly, a deliberate delivery of the disease. Using this event as proof that the disease, nor any other problems of the wasteland, could be prayed away, and by placing agents in the church, Philip had a large degree of control over the public opinion, and therefore also over the church when the primate died in 2095. Yet the same plague that gave Philip this boon also gave him a bane. His forces in the west were decimated by the disease. Instead, he turned his eyes eastward and mounted 2 failed campaigns against the wilderness of Nova Scotia and the ruins of New York. Between 2096 and 2200, the Quebecois monarchs would maintain their western force while fighting in the east in an attempt to expand, but sadly for them, advancing was a slow and bloody process, and yet this century of armed conflict in the east allowed the Quebecois to test their tactics and arms against foes that were somewhat organized and dedicated. Had it not been for the ghoul plagues and the occasional migration of raiders out of the east, the Quebecois may have turned west far sooner, and to the disastrous results for the GNR. In 2185, an outbreak of cholera in Forfatherland caused the normally insular forefathers to accept outside aid. The Protectorate, Brotherhood of Steel, Lansing Republic, and Ontarian medical staff rushed into the area alongside Quebecois to stop the outbreaks before they could decimate the countryside as the measles had in 2094. The plague was quickly handled, and again direct delivery of a bioattack was suspected due to the scope and scale of the disease. During this operation, the intelligence services of the monarchy made contacts and began the arrangement of creating small cells of men and women that they had corrupted through blackmail or threats of violence inside Forfatherland. One of these events was the beating and abuse of the sisters of Heinrich Deutschkopf when he was 9 years of age. He would later go on to radically change Forfather society, and there is reason to believe this may have been at the hands of Quebecois machinations. When Deutschkopf received his religious vision in 2217, it is possible that this was brought about by the use of psychotropic drugs and hypnotic suggestion by Quebecois intelligence agents, rather than some mystic vision. Unknown to the forefathers, and all throughout 2218, the intelligence services of the Quebecois arranged various instances of violence and threats to convince the forefathers that an outwardly aggressive stance, such as Deutschkopf's vision, was sensible. By 2219, the transformation of Quebec society was completed. The military was believed by the lower classes as a chance to escape labor. A constant influx of recruits was no longer an issue. The royalty was completely materialist in their outlook, and only a few enclaves of initially religious people were left in positions of power inside the monarchy. The primate, in desperation, threatened the monarch with excommunication should rumors of the monarchy's behavior prove to be true, particularly that of build-up for war and various other illicit crimes. This was something that the monarch, Vanron de Marais, could not forget. In 2220, the efforts of the Quebecois intelligence services paid off, as the forefathers launched an attack upon the Greater Northern Republic. The GNR quickly fell apart due to Quebecois corruption of various officials. On one side are the Lansing Republic and the Brotherhood of Steel, on another are the forefathers, and a third side in the conflict was the Ontarian armies, which were sent into battles at the behest of the Quebecois, and ended up fighting on a two-front war against the Yoopers on one side and the Ottawans on the other. In Ottawa, the scale of the Quebec corruption was found out by a reporter, and the public opinion quickly turned against the Foxes. Sadly, it was not enough to aid in any meaningful manner, and the Ottawans ended up fighting a long siege as they were surrounded by once allies that had now become foes. Worse, the Ottawan field army had not escaped this corruption, and its generals were directing it alongside Quebecois forces towards Detroit to accompany the Royal Quebec Zouaves, their elite infantry brigade. We shall not go back over the details and events of the Forefather War, but we shall comment that the various powers abandoned their efforts to take Detroit. When the various powers abandoned their efforts to take Detroit, the last opponents were the Lansing Republic's MMR and the Quebecois Grande Armée. Recent access to Quebecois records show that the greatest ally to the MMR defense and the cause was the inability of Quebecois generals to shift tactics. The lead-rain approach had been so indoctrinated into their consciousness that no other strategy seemed possible. Had it not been for the MMR's exhaustion when the revenge march ended near the limits of Toronto, the monarchy today might be no further west than Montreal. King Desmarais had lost a war, which never looks well upon the record of any king, and he needed someone to blame. He chose to blame the Church. By using his agents already within its ranks, he was able to create a series of conspiracies and plant evidence of the Church's involvement with the Lansing Nova Pax movement. This branded them as traitors to the crown. The wounded pride of the Quebecois now had a viable target, and their response was vicious. Priests were attacked in the streets, nuns were shamed, monasteries burned and looted. To protect his fellow priests, the primate approached the monarch for aid. The terms of calling off the attacks and propaganda were the death knell of the primate's authority. Desmarais forced the primate to draft a papal bull equivalent that would forbid any sitting primate, cardinal, or priest from speaking on matters of state, ever again. Nor could they speak about the character or religious status, or the actions and their moral worth, or the character of any noble or royal house member. Their voice stifled, the New World Catholic Church faded in importance, having only the most religious and lowest members of society now as obedient servants. The monarchy had no one to speak against it, and it began to turn away from any sense of Christian mercy and justice. Rebuilding from the Forefather War became Desmarais' new concern, as well as keeping the eastern and southern borders secure. To this end, he established initiatives to build war bots of the monarchy's own and place an edict upon all his successors not to invade any former GNR territories again until they outnumbered the Lansing Republic and its allies by a margin of at least 4-1. A constant low-grade war, in the form of raids, began to settle into lines, and it appears as lines of trenches and fortifications has grown up along the remnant of where the Quebecois chased the Ontarians. This is now called the trench works. The trench works has been quite the drain on Quebecois resources and also on Ontarian resources, but there seems no way around it. The modern Quebecois is a citizen that believes his government is the best on earth, that his culture is the best on earth, that they are the saviors of humankind, and that only their courage and personal honor will end up saving the world. They believe that the performing of one's duty is held as the primary criteria by which they should be judged. In practice, a high degree of corruption in the form of favors and elitism pervades the society, but at least lip service is given to this last idea and is present amongst the common people. Unlike other cultures that have taken the direction of duty above all else, the Quebecois are not stoic. They often use excess drinking and music to engage as an escape from pressures of the post-war life, and the stereotype of the Quebecois as being sexually promiscuous is not an exaggeration. Since the days of King Laurent, there has been a concerted effort by the monarchy to remove the stigma of being an unmarried parent. The issue of such unions can always find a place in the fields or in the military. Quebecois are very emotional and also prone to fits of anger if thwarted from their tasks. Thus, the Ganders characterize a Quebecois as being a hard-party libertine that cannot be trusted unless they give you their personal word of honor. But despite these faults, every Quebecois is convinced that any other Quebecois, even that of a serf or a criminal, is worth at least 10 Ganders. The fascist ideology that the monarchy promotes is an excellent social glue. All communications are monitored, lest treason escape the notice of the state. All education is directed by the state so that each case thinks only of its own role and its own skills. All production is regulated and directed by the state. All concern for what is to be endeavored comes from the state. The individual is not of any importance save in how he obeys and how he serves the state. But not all Quebecois agree with this societal model. Since 2293, a pirate radio station, La Belle Nuit, has been broadcasting at random intervals. The broadcasts involve music, commentary, political diatribes, and radicalism, and almost all of it goes against the official monarchy doctrines, news services, and censorship guidelines. Leaflets and secret societies are beginning to rise in membership, particularly La Révolution de Rouge. If the monarchy cannot expand, the pressures that are inside of it will force it to boil over in a revolution, a lesson that the French-descended monarchs of Quebec should already know, and Lansing remembers.